My only company these days was the ticking clock in the living room. Each tick reminded me of the unending monotony that had taken over my life. It felt like a hammer slamming against my chest. On yet another of his company trips, my husband Ted had been gone many months now. My name is Jenny, and initially, I had welcomed the aloneness to breathe free from his expectations' weight. Now, though the quiet was stifling. Seated on the couch, I stared out the window with a book in my lap left unopened. I was a specter going through my house, all of it was so vibrant, so lively. The days ran together, and none of them were distinguishable from the rest. Wake up, clean the house, make coffee, watch TV, go to bed. Rinse and repeat this. This was a calming regularity, but also one that left me somewhat unfulfilled, as if I were living life rather than living life. My daydream was disrupted by the sound of the doorbell. I raised my eyebrows at the clock. Late afternoon and I was expecting a guest. With the insane wish that it was Ted, home unexpectedly, my heart jumped a little. Still, I refuted it. Ted was always informed about his return home. I stood up, straightened my dress, and went to the door. I opened it to come face to face with a view that made me breathless. There was Chris, his face cracking into a cunning grin and a duffel bag hanging over one shoulder. My nephew. Taller than I remembered, his boyish traits are now sharp and angular. His black hair was disheveled as if he had recently run his hands across it, and his eyes sparkled with a kind of life I had not felt in years. "Aunt Jenny," he said, his voice warm and close, "long time no see." I blinked, trying to grasp his sudden appearance. "Chris? What exactly are you here for?" He shrugged, smiling more widely. I was around and made a stop. Moreover, I stopped not sure what to say if you might use some company. It had been years since last I had seen Chris. He was the free spirit of the family, always on the move and never settled. Still, his presence there was somewhat exciting. Distinct. It was as though he had brought some of the outside world in with him, a breath of fresh air that stirred something inside me. I finally said, stepping aside to let him in, "Welcome, then." His cologne, a blend of sandalwood and something musky that made my stomach flip, was detected as he passed me. Shaking my head, I tried to get rid of the odd feeling. Chris was the nephew of mine. This was not something I ought to feel. He set his bag on the door side and faced me, his eyes scanning the room. "Wow, this house hasn't changed at all. Still as cozy as I remember it." I smiled, attempting to disregard how my heart was pounding. "Yes, well, some things never change." He laughed, and the shiver down my spine grew colder. "I imagine not. So, Aunt Jenny, how have you been? You appear different." I lifted an eyebrow, folding my arms across my chest. "Different how?" He cocked his head to the side, examining me so thoroughly I felt naked. "I don't know. You just look more alive than I've ever seen you." I nervously laughed, not knowing what to do. "Well, I guess that's good." He nodded, his eyes staying on me for another second before he looked away. "So, what's for dinner?" "I'm starving." I blinked in surprise at the sudden topic shift. Dinner. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I didn't have anything prepared. He faced me again, smiling once more. "No problem. I can cook. Why don't I make something for us?" I hesitated, not knowing if I should take him up on his offer. But the thought of having someone else worry about me, if only for a night, was too tempting to pass up. "Okay," I finally replied, "but don't expect me to be impressed." He grinned, and the room filled with the radiance of it, a radiance I had not felt in months. Challenge accepted. As he walked towards the kitchen, I couldn't help but stare. There was something in the way he moved, so free and assured, that captivated me. It was as though he brought a bit of the world with him, a reminder of everything that I had been denying myself. Yet as I stood there, looking at him, I could not help but feel that something was about to shift. something that I did not know I was ready for. The air was thick with the aroma of herbs and garlic as Chris flitted back and forth with an ease that surprised me. He had never been a sitter, always flitting from task to task. But here, in my kitchen, he seemed comfortable. I rested against the counter, observing him chop vegetables with a proficiency that spoke of practice. "Since when do you cook?" I questioned, unable to conceal the curiosity in my tone. He looked up at me, a grin lurking around his mouth, because I figured eating out every night was going to break the bank. And because it's an excellent method for impressing the ladies. I lifted an eyebrow, even as I couldn't prevent the slight smile that pulled at my mouth. "Well, I should hope you're not trying to impress me." He laughed, low and rich. "We'll see about that." While he cooked, I was sucked into his tales. He spoke about his journeys, what he had seen, and who he had met. Every one of his tales carried with it an air of adventure that I hadn't experienced in decades. It was as if he'd lived a century of lives since I'd last set eyes on him, and I couldn't help but feel envious. "You make it sound so simple," I told him, a tinge of wistfulness entering my voice. "Just getting up and going wherever the wind takes you." He stopped, his gaze locking with mine. "It's not always simple. But it's worth it. Life's too short to be standing in one spot, day after day." I turned away, his words striking a bit too close to the target. "I suppose you're right." He put down the knife and turned to me, his face easing. "And you, Aunt Jenny? What have you been doing?" I shrugged, embarrassed all of a sudden. "Nothing. Just the usual." He moved a step nearer, his eyes boring into mine. "You don't have to pretend with me, you know. I always can tell if something's wrong." I could feel a lump develop in my throat, and I abruptly looked away. "It's nothing, just life." He held out his hand, palm lightly brushing against mine. The touch was brief, but it electrified me. "You don't have to do it alone, you know. I'm here for you." I gazed up at him, my heart racing in my chest. Something in his eyes, something that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't been in years. It was as if he could see past the mask I'd constructed, to the very center of me. "Thank you," I whispered, barely able to say anything. He smiled, his hand lingering on mine a split second longer before he drew it back. "Anytime." We ate dinner together, conversing freely with one another. It was as if the years that had passed and separated us were nothing and all that was left was the connection we had always shared. And yet, there was something more too, something that I couldn't quite define. A tension in the air that could not be verbalized but could not be avoided either. As the night went on, I caught myself stealing glances his way, my heart skipping a beat each time our eyes would catch. It was a risky game, one that I knew I had no business playing. But for the first time in a long while, I felt alive. And I wasn't willing to give that up. The evening had given way, and the house was still apart from the gentle humming of the fridge. Chris and I were on the couch, a bottle of wine sitting between us. The conversation had become more intimate, and I was sharing with him in a way that I had not shared with others. "I just feel so trapped," I confessed, twirling the wine in my glass. "Like I'm just going through the motions and waiting for something to happen." He nodded, his expression contemplative. "I understand. But sometimes you've got to make things happen. Take chances. Live a little." I laughed, even though there was nothing to laugh about. Easier said than done. He leaned back, his arm across the top of the sofa. "You'd be surprised. Sometimes one moment is all it takes to change everything." I stared at him, my heart missing a beat. There was a tone in his voice, a tone that led me to believe that he was not discussing life in general. But before me being able to say anything, he moved and his shirt sleeve pushed up, showing a tattoo on his forearm. I hadn't noticed it previously, but now I was struck by it. It was a complex design, a mixture of curving forms and geometric shapes that appeared to be telling a story. "What's that?" I asked, indicating his arm. He looked down, a slight smile on his face. "Oh, this? It's just something I came across some time ago. A reminder. A reminder of what? I prompted, curious. He paused, his eyes locking with mine, of the decisions we make and the roads we choose. It's simple to lose your way, you know? To forget what's real. This brings it back to me. A shiver ran through my body, his words striking a chord in me that I had not expected. It's beautiful, I breathed. He smiled, his eyes still on me. Thanks. I'm glad you like it. There was a pause, the air between us electric with something I couldn't quite identify. I felt like I wanted to move closer to him, to bridge the distance between us. But before I had a chance to, he leaned in, his hand grazing mine. "Aunt Jenny," he whispered, his deep voice trembling with a hunger that had me breathless. "I know this is going to sound insane, but I feel something around you. Something I haven't felt in years." I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my head reeling with 1,000 thoughts. This was all wrong. He was my nephew. And yet, all at the same time, I couldn't deny the attraction between us, the way he brought me to life in a manner that I had not experienced in years. "Chris," I whispered, my voice shaking, I don't know what to say." He raised his hand, his palms softly cradling my cheek. "You don't need to say anything. Just allow me to be here with you. Allow me to show you what it is to live." I felt a tear roll down my face and closed my eyes, leaning into his touch. For the first time in so long, I felt seen. Understood. And I couldn't help but notice the attraction that I was feeling for him, even though it would be so wrong. But I was given no chance to speak, for the opening of the door broke the enchantment. We both turned, our eyes widening, as Buck came in, surprise written on his face. "Hey, guys," he broke in, his voice cutting across the tension. "Didn't figure on bumping into you here, Chris." I panicked and felt a wave wash over me, and I jerked back from Chris, my heart pounding. "Buck," I whispered, my voice tense. What are you doing here?" He shrugged, leaning his bag against the door. "I was in the area and figured I'd drop over. Didn't intend to intrude." I could sense my cheeks flush, and I stood up hastily, trying to compose myself. No, you are not interrupting. We were just talking." Chris also rose to his feet, his face inscrutable. "Yeah, just catching up." Buck glanced back and forth, frowning. "All right. Well, I'm going to get a beer. Do you two want anything?" I shook my head, feeling relief as he entered the kitchen. But when I looked at Chris, I saw the tension in his eyes, the things unsaid between us. The moment had passed, but the emotions lingered. And I was aware that our relationship was never going to be the same. The rest of the night was a blur. Buck's trip had destroyed the fragile truce between Chris and me, and I withdrew into myself, attempting to process everything that transpired. Chris, on his part, also appeared to know my unease and kept his distance from me, but I felt his eyes on me throughout the night. He seemed to wait patiently for something, some signal on my behalf that I was ready to face the feelings his kiss had stirred up in us. But I wasn't prepared. I couldn't be. What had nearly occurred was too real to be acceptable, and a feeling of shame began to set in. This was my nephew Chris. How could I have allowed things to have gone as far as they had? As the night wore on, I grew more and more restless. I needed to escape, to get some air. So when Buck announced he was going, I leaped at the opportunity. "I'm going to bed, I think," I said, getting up and not meeting Chris's eye. "I've had a long day." Buck nodded, hugging me briefly. "All right, Aunt Jenny. Be careful." I managed a smile, though it seemed weak on my lips. "You too, Buck." As he departed, I looked at Chris, still seated on the couch, his face empty. "Good night, Chris," I murmured, my voice hardly audible. He stood up, his gaze sweeping over mine. "Aunt Jenny, wait." I could feel my heart missing a beat, but I shook my head. Not now, Chris. Please. He hesitated, then nodded, though I could see he was disappointed. Okay. Good night. I spun around and made a hasty retreat back to my bedroom, slamming the door shut behind me and leaning back against it with a pounding heart. I was hit with a wave of emotions: shame, lust, confusion. It was too much, and I felt tears spring up in my eyes. I collapsed to the floor, covering my face with my hands. What was I doing? How had I allowed this to get so out of control? But even as I attempted to push the thoughts aside, I could not ignore the reality. Chris had stirred something in me, something that I had kept under lock and key. And now that it was stirred, I did not know if I could reverse it. I sat for hours, my brain buzzing with 1,000 possibilities. But later, fatigue took over, and I went to bed, praying that sleep would provide some sort of direction. But as I lay there, looking at the ceiling, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. The bond between me and Chris had been established, and regardless of how much I tried, I could not ignore it. And as I fell asleep, I couldn't help but speculate about what the morning could have in store. Thank you for listening. Did you like these infidelity stories? Drop a comment below if you want part 2. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for more cheating wife stories.